The man who spent $6 billion to destroy professional golf is now sitting quietly, telling the world that someone else will have to figure out what comes next. I need you to sit with that for a second. Imagine being the #1 golfer on the planet for 331 weeks. Imagine galleries holding their breath when you walk to the tee. Imagine having more presence, more power, more raw talent than anyone in the sport. And then imagine one Sunday afternoon in April 1996 taking all of that, every bit of it, and watching it collapse in front of a worldwide television audience in the space of 18 holes. And then imagine carrying that moment inside you for the next 25 years. Because that one Sunday is what built LIV Golf. And the wreckage of that one Sunday is what ultimately destroyed it. But here is what I need you to understand before we go any further. The most shocking part of this story is not how it ended. It is what happened in the middle, when everything was actually working, when the revolution looked real, when the PGA Tour was genuinely shaking. That is the part nobody talks about honestly. And I'm going to get there. But first, stay with me, because this story only makes sense if you understand the man before the money. If this is your first time on this channel, subscribe right now and hit the bell. We do not do surface level here. We go deep, we go long, and we tell the full story. Now, let's get into it. Greg Norman at his absolute peak was not just a golfer. He was a phenomenon. 6 feet tall, blonde, tan, built like an athlete from a different era entirely. He hit the golf ball harder and further than anyone of his generation. He became a global celebrity at a time when golfers simply did not become global celebrities. He was world #1 for 331 weeks, a record that stood so long it seemed permanent. He won the Open Championship twice. He dominated leaderboards on every continent. And yet, and this is the part that never went away, his entire career is defined almost entirely by the things he did not win. Bob Tway held a bunker shot on the final hole of the 1986 PGA Championship and stole the title. Larry Mize, a journeyman by any reasonable standard, chipped in from 140 feet in a 1987 Masters playoff and broke Norman's heart all over again. And in 1986 alone, Norman held a 54-hole lead at all 4 major championships and won none of them. Not one. But 1996 was different from all of it. Augusta National, Sunday morning, Norman standing on the first tee with a 6-shot lead. The largest 54-hole advantage in the entire history of the Masters. Nick Faldo was in second. The championship felt like a formality. You know what happened? If you're a golf fan, you have seen the footage. Norman shot 78. Faldo played perhaps the greatest final round in Masters history and won by 5. A 6-shot lead became a 5-shot deficit. An 11-stroke swing in a single Sunday afternoon. And the cruelest part was not the collapse itself. The cruelest part was how Norman handled it. He shook Faldo's hand on the 18th green. He smiled for the cameras. He carried himself with the dignity of a champion while his dream dissolved in front of the entire world. And then for years afterward, he told everyone publicly that he had moved on. But the people who knew him said the losses never truly left. And the decisions he made 25 years later confirm exactly that. Now, before I tell you what happened when the Saudi money arrived, I want you to think about something, because this is where the story gets genuinely complicated. Was Norman wrong about everything? Because the answer to that question matters enormously for understanding what came next. And the answer might surprise you. Stay with me. In 2021, Saudi Arabia's public investment fund began looking for a figurehead to launch a new golf league that would compete directly with the PGA Tour. They needed someone with credibility, with connections, with enough personal grievance against the established order to make the fight feel real. They found Greg Norman. Norman had spent years attempting to get rival tours off the ground. None of them had survived past the planning stage. This time the Saudis had something none of those earlier attempts had ever possessed. Effectively unlimited money. Norman became the commissioner and CEO of LIV Golf and threw himself into it with a ferocity that shocked even people who knew him well. He was 66 years old and had not needed to work for decades. But this was not about needing to work. This was something else entirely. This was every loss, every heartbreak, every Sunday afternoon that had ever humiliated him. poured into one final fight. He recruited with an aggression the sport had never seen. Phil Mickelson, five-time major winner, one of the most beloved figures in American golf. Gone. Dustin Johnson, former world number one. Gone. Cam Smith, fresh off winning the Open Championship. Gone. Brooks Koepka, four-time major champion. Gone. Bryson DeChambeau. Gone. Jon Rahm, two-time major winner and reigning Masters champion, in one of the most stunning defections in the history of the sport. Gone. Norman signed them all. He wrote the checks and smiled for the cameras and told every reporter who would listen that LIV Golf was the future, that the PGA Tour was a relic, that the players were finally free. And for about 18 months, it genuinely looked like he might be right. The events were lavish. $30 million per event in prize money, structured so that even last place paid serious money. The team format was genuinely innovative, something professional golf had never seriously tried. LIV was pushing into markets where the PGA Tour had never had a real footprint. The establishment's fury only amplified the sense that something significant was actually happening. And here is the part that gets buried in every conversation about this era. Norman's core critique of the PGA Tour was not wrong. The tour had operated for decades as a closed system that distributed wealth inequitably, that gave players very little say over their own careers, that treated its biggest stars generously, but left the middle tier of touring professionals earning wages that would shock fans who assumed golf was universally lucrative. The question of player rights and free agency in professional golf was real. It needed to be asked. But Norman did not ask it. He detonated it. And the difference between those two things was enormous. Because the single most significant obstacle to LIV achieving any lasting legitimacy was not an abstract debate about sports washing or Saudi politics. It was the personal animosity that Norman's presence generated among the exact people whose cooperation LIV actually needed. And at the top of that list was one name: Tiger Woods. Tiger had not been a dominant competitive force for years. His body had limited what he could do on a golf course. But his influence over where the money flows, over what the sport's future actually needs to contain, over any framework that could actually work, that influence was greater than any active player and greater than any administrator alive. And Tiger made his position on Greg Norman absolutely clear. At the 2022 Masters, asked directly about Norman's role in any potential reconciliation, Tiger said Norman was not the right fit. 5 words. That is all it took. Anyone who understood professional golf's political reality understood that as long as Norman was the face of LIV, Tiger would not be at the table. And without Tiger at the table, no solution was ever going to be complete. Full stop. The same dynamic repeated itself in every attempted negotiation. Norman's history of feuds with PGA Tour administrators went back decades. The grudges were real on both sides. And every time conversations about the sport's future got close to producing something workable, Norman's presence became the thing that pushed everything backward. He was not an asset to the revolution anymore. He had become its most significant liability. And now pay attention, because what happened in June 2023 is the moment that tells you everything about how this story was always going to end. When the framework agreement between the PGA Tour and the Saudi PIF was announced to the world, Norman found out what his real position in all of this actually was. He had not been part of the negotiations. The Saudis and the tour's leadership had conducted every critical conversation around him, above him, and without him in the room. The man who launched the revolution was not trusted to be present when the peace was being discussed. He was replaced as CEO before his contract expired in August of 2025. His farewell statement said he remained loyal to the sport he had spent his life in. That claim produced perhaps the most perfectly calibrated response of the entire LIV saga. PGA Tour winner Michael Kim went on social media and asked an AI tool to define the word loyalty, offering no further commentary. The implication did not need explaining. The man who had spent 3 years personally overseeing the most sustained assault on the PGA Tour's commercial dominance in the sport's history was now claiming loyalty to the institution he had been dismantling. And now in the spring of 2026, the full picture is visible. The Saudi Public Investment Fund has announced it is pulling its direct funding from LIV Golf at the end of the current season. The league that was going to transform the sport, force the PGA Tour to its knees, and represent the future of professional golf is now scrambling for survival. The new CEO is working frantically to attract new investors. The players who signed guaranteed contracts worth hundreds of millions of dollars combined are staring at a future that is genuinely uncertain. Norman sat down with a golf podcast in April 2026 and was asked directly whether LIV could survive without the Saudi money. His answer was quietly devastating. He said it would totally depend on the new CEO, that the new CEO would need to get out there and find new investors. The man who spent 4 years telling the world he had the vision, the relationships, and the commitment to transform professional golf is now saying someone else will have to figure out what comes next. And so the verdict the golf world has been building toward for 3 years has now been delivered. Not in a single dramatic moment, but in the quiet accumulation of outcomes. The league is collapsing. The man who built it was removed before it collapsed. The conversations about player returns became dramatically easier the moment Norman was no longer the central figure. That verdict is not that Norman was evil. He was not evil. There are people in this story with genuinely questionable motives, and Norman is not one of them. The verdict is something more precise and more damning than evil. Norman turned what could have been a structural negotiation about player rights and revenue sharing into a personal war. He made it about him, his history with the tour, his grievances, his need to prove that the system which had denied him at Augusta and at Valhalla and at Augusta again was not as invincible as it thought it was. He made the revolution personal, and in doing so, he made it easier for the tour to dismiss the legitimate parts of what he was arguing. He spent $6 billion of Saudi money. He divided the sport for 3 years. He created genuine uncertainty in the careers of dozens of players who trusted his promises. And when the peace finally came, it came not because of him, but despite him, around him, and without him in the room. That is the truth about Greg Norman. Not a simple story, not a villain story, a tragic story in the original sense of the word. A man with genuine gifts and genuine grievances who could not find a way to separate his personal wounds from the mission he had convinced himself he was serving. The great white shark spent his entire playing career circling the biggest prizes in golf and finding ways not to take them. In his second career, he circled the biggest transformation in golf's history and found a way not to complete that either. The talent was always real. The commitment was always real. But somehow, in the critical moment, the outcome was always the same. He is watching from the outside now. The league he built is searching for investors. The players he signed are searching for certainty. And Greg Norman is giving podcast interviews, saying quietly that someone else will have to figure out what comes next. If this one landed for you, drop a like before you go. It takes 2 seconds, and it tells the algorithm that stories like this deserve to reach more people. Subscribe if you want to be here for what comes next, because there is more coming, and only gets deeper.